Hello, welcome to this Facebook Live event coming to you from the beautifully sunny Cambridge University Botanic Gardens. I'm Sam Brockington, I'm the curator of the gardens, and I'm responsible for looking after our living collections in the garden, which total some 8,000 plant species. So this Facebook Live event is part of our online Festival of Plants. Normally the garden would be full of tents and people, but because of this COVID lockdown, we are coming to you online. And this is the last day in which we've been talking about topics around plant conservation, which is one of our important missions in the garden alongside research and learning. So today I'm going to be giving you some examples of some rare and important trees in the garden, why we look after them, why we grow them, and what role we play in plant conservation and botanic gardens more generally can play in safeguarding rare and threatened plant diversity. This is also a chance for me to take some questions from you, so please feel free to enter any comments into the Facebook Live comment box, and my colleagues will attempt to get them to me and I will relay back to you. Yeah, okay. So for context, we're on the main walk, and behind Helen I'm looking at the main gate of the garden. So this was originally the gate that came down from where the garden was in the centre of town, and it used to be the main entrance into the garden, but now it's more like a ceremonial entrance. Ironically, the garden back in the day never used to be open to the public, and so it very much would have felt like it does now, with no one in it. And to get access to it, you had to have a tour from my predecessors, curators, and so in a way we're going back in time with this experience. But as you look the other way, you can see all the way down the Henslow's Walk. This is one of the main avenues in the garden, and it's flanked by trees on either side that were designed and planted by our founder, John Stevens Henslow, who was Charles Darwin's mentor. But I'm going to take you over to one corner of this avenue, and it's a special corner because it has some of our what might be called our flagship species. In a way, this is a bit like this sort of concept of the big five in a safari park. These are some of our famous species that everyone will kind of recognize, but still are quite important and actually quite rare tree species. So the first is this Sequoiadendron giganteum. This, of course, is the giant redwood, and is famous for being the largest tree species in the world by bulk, not by height. That's a title that belongs to a close relative of the giant redwood, the Pacific coastwood redwood, but it's a huge tree, and even in the UK, growing outside of its native habitat, it's a beautiful specimen. So it normally grows in native California, and even in its native habitat, it is threatened. So if you go back when it was first discovered, it was intensively logged. And it was logged despite the fact that in fact it wasn't really very good quality wood, and so you had these enormous gorgeous specimens being chopped down and turned into really inconsequential material like matchsticks and building woods and so forth. But one of the advantages of that period is it really brought the awareness of these trees to the public, and they were then protected in their own reserves. However, to this day, because of all of the way in which humans are affecting the climate and controlling the environment, these trees depend on regular fire cycles for their germination, for their regeneration, and the way in which we've interrupted that means that some of those native populations are still struggling to regenerate properly. And I think this is where botanic gardens can come into their significance. So because this tree is quite widely cultivated, we had a collector, William Lobb, who collected many seeds back in the day and distributed them across the world. It's quite a commonly grown tree in gardens, and so gardens therefore provide this stopgap, this last minute insurance policy in case serious things happen to the populations in the wild. They also serve as a resource by which you can repopulate populations that are struggling in the wild. So this is something we call ex situ conservation, so holding species outside of their natural habitat, and that's a very important role that botanic gardens can play. So now I want to take you a little bit further into this corner to another species which is actually a close relative the Sequoiadendron giganteum, and that is the Metasequoia Glyptostroboides that we're edging towards at the moment. While we're tiptoeing towards it, tied together by this cable, does anyone have any questions at this point?
We haven't got any questions at the moment, but maybe people could put them in the comments box.
Okay, no questions at the moment, but please feel free to put them in the comment box as we continue. Okay, so now we've got up to the Metasequoia Glyptostroboides. This common name of this is adorned redwood, and this is a very special tree for the garden, and it's known as a living fossil, and that's an odd term, but it means that the tree was first described from the fossil record. So it was first identified as a species from a fossil in the early 1900s, and it was only later in the 1940s that people realized that the species was still alive. So it was rediscovered in some valleys in China, and that caused huge excitement, and botanic gardens all over the world wanted to get their hands on this famous living fossil, and the first people to get their hands on it were the Arnold Arboretum in North America in about 1949. But shortly after that, Cambridge University Botanic Gardens was able to get some, and they grew and planted very successfully in the garden. So we had them by about 1951. Around that time, we invited the then directors of Kew and Edinburgh down to have dinner, and ostensibly the topic of that conversation was to work out how the UK was going to get hold of the dawn redwood and grow it. What we didn't tell them is that we already had it. And so after dinner, the then director took his colleagues around the garden and gleefully pointed out that we already had this dawn redwood growing. And I tell you that story because in a way it paints a picture of a culture where in fact botanic gardens were competing to hold rare and precious, unusual material, and to an extent that holds true today. But as I would like to explain a bit later, it's very important that we collaborate extensively when we're thinking about safeguarding threatened plant species, and it's something in fact that we do collaborate on very successfully. And a nice example of that collaboration is the third tree species I'd like to show you, and this is obviously a much smaller, younger specimen which will eventually be hopefully a large and beautiful tree, and this is the Willamia nobilis, the Willamy pine. Again, this is a living fossil. It was first known from the fossil record and then discovered to still be growing in a tiny ravine in about a few hundred kilometers outside of Sydney in Willamy National Park, which is where it gets its name. But there were only 100 individuals this growing in the wild, so it's hugely susceptible to climate change, changes of the environment, and we've seen that recently with the fires in Australia. So those fires that ravaged Australia came very close to destroying this population, and in fact the Australian Fire Service had to swoop in and install irrigation to save it. But shortly after it was discovered in 1994, they realized they could clonally propagate it, and so they sent it around all over the world, and many gardens such as ours have a number of species of Willamia nobilis, and again we're holding these rare species in multiple locations to safeguard it in case the time comes where we maybe have to reintroduce it back into the wild.
We've got a question here, Sam.
Okay, got a question coming in.
Professor Dave Goulson suggested last week we should plant trees now for the climate in the UK 50 years on. Any suggestions of what trees we should be planting if we have space?
I think we need to think very carefully about what trees to plant. Of course, there's a debate about whether we plant native species or whether we think a little bit about, what are the tree species that might be doing well in the climate in 50 years' time. I think possibly we'll be looking at relatives of our native species that are coming from slightly further south. In warmer climates, that might be one option, but we have to think very carefully about that because of the possibility of introducing disease and other factors. So that is a complicated question. I think a number of conservation bodies are a little concerned about this plant a tree sort of campaign because it's a little too easy. It's something that politicians can sort of say, okay, we're going to, as they did in the last election, we're going to plant X million number of trees. But in fact, there are a large number of habitats in the UK that are not forests, that will not benefit from the planting of the trees, but serve a really important role in conserving other types of biodiversity. So yes, trees do have a role to play in mitigating climate change and protecting biodiversity, but we do need to think a bit more holistically about how we manage our landscapes. It can't just be about tree planting. Okay, so I'll just wrap up by saying that I'm in just one corner of the garden. We've got 40 acres out there full of beautiful plants, full of endangered plant species, and beyond us there are another 3,500 botanic gardens. And we now work very closely with our network, with our sister institutions, to understand what they hold, what we hold, and what we should be collecting in a targeted way. And so we're thinking quite carefully about how many individuals of a species we should hold. How do we capture the most genetic diversity to make the collections that we have meaningful for conservation? And I think we have tremendous potential as institutions, as collective organisations, to have an impact, both in terms of the plants we hold, but in also how we use those collections to drive activities outside of our boundaries.
We've got one more question.
Okay, one more question.
What is the most recently collected threatened plant in the garden?
Gosh, well, we get them. We bring in about somewhere between 500 and 1,000 plants a year. So we're bringing in plants all the time. The most recent one that leaps to mind is an expedition that we undertook, or my colleague Angela, who's our assistant curator, undertook to northern Vietnam. And we collected there a species called Magnolia grandis, and that is a species of tree which is now down to 50 individuals in the wild. So we literally went on that expedition partly just to focus on that one tree species, and we collected seed from that with our colleagues at the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh and National Botanic Garden Wales, and we are all now growing up seeds from that one species. So Magnolia grandis is the one that leaps to mind. I do have one question that I promise is not a plant. It just came in earlier, and this is from Andrew from the Buddleia Garden, which is a website and a garden devoted to the genus Buddleia. And Andrew asks, or makes a statement: many collections of trees and shrubs hold single specimens, and the same cultivar may be distributed, thus limiting the gene pool available should the species be lost in its native habitat. The question is, do you think ex situ conservation should also focus on maintaining a viable and varied gene pool of selected species, rather than each and every collection gathering together as many species as possible? So it's a really good question. Andrew's making the point that, if we all hold just one individual of a species, or one garden is the only one that holds one individual of a species, then you're really holding very limited genetic material. And really, when you're introducing material back into an environment or trying to support a threatened population, genetic diversity is really important. Otherwise, you just get inbreeding and slow decline of a species. So holding large amounts of genetic diversity is important, and there's a trade-off, because we can't hold all of the species in the world. So I think we recognise that we have to focus on particular individuals, and we have to hold particular species, and we have to hold those species in sufficient numbers of individuals to be meaningful. But I think the way we work now as a network, if we're aware of what other gardens hold, if we're aware of how a species is distributed across that network, we can hold that genetic diversity in a distributed manner quite effectively. They don't all have to be held in one garden, and I think that's a powerful feature of the network and how we operate now. Okay, well, thank you very much. I think there's no more questions, so thank you very much for attending the Facebook Live, and I hope you've enjoyed the Festival of Plants. If you've been excited by any of the things I've spoken about in this brief talk, please go to the website, because there's a lot more material on there, more focused stories about our work in conservation, both in the garden and outside of our boundaries, and you can find a lot more information there. Thank you very much.